Could not believe.
Hello, I'm Paul Handley, the editor of the Church Times. I don't know about you, but my family have been having we've been having. Sorry, I'm just getting some feedback. That's a good start, isn't it? I'm just going to stop that now. Yeah. Right. I'm going to ignore it for a minute. So my family's been having family quizzes, and my daughter likes to know before the quiz starts how many questions there are going to be. Well, I can't tell you that, but I can tell you how the format of this next couple of hours is going to go. So for the first hour, it's going to be I'm going to be in conversation with 4 fantastic contributors to our pandemic series, and I'll tell you who they are in a minute. Secondly. And then there's going to be a 5-minute break between the sessions, and then the second half there'll be another 4 in the company of Ed, my assistant editor. So that's how things are going to go. The second half is probably going to be more professional than this one, given that I've started so badly. But before we start, I'd like to have a commercial break, and this is for the Church House Bookshop, because for an indeterminate amount of time, there will be 20% off a whole series of books which are authored by some of our speakers or are related to the subjects we've been talking about. We can start with some pre-recorded videos from my 4 authors, and I'll tell you who they are now. We have Philip North, who's the Bishop of Burnley in the Diocese of Blackburn. There's Anne Morisy, who is a freelance theologian, a church warden, and a lecturer. Bex Lewis, who is a senior lecturer in digital marketing at Manchester Metropolitan University, and an author on digital matters to do with children, safeguarding, etc. And Kate Wharton, who's a vicar of St Bartholomew's in Roby and local diocese, who's and also assistant national director of New Wine. So let's hear their contributions now, and then we'll come back and we'll be able to have a conversation and some questions.
Hello, I'm Philip North, and a very warm welcome to Burnley. In this series of Church Times webinars, I'm going to be thinking about ministry and the sort of lay and ordained ministry that is emerging from this pandemic. To do that, let me tell you where I was this morning. It's July the 5th, the first day on which public worship has been allowed, so I went to a multicultural area of Nelson. I was in the parish church, where the lay people had done a fabulous job of getting the building ready, making sure the risk assessments had been done, ensuring that we could have a really joyful celebration of the Eucharist. The priest in that parish, though, is having to shield, so he was in his vicarage, live streaming to another congregation. What does that story tell us about ministry in the future? Think first of all about those lay people who'd stepped up so wonderfully to enable worship to happen. I think one thing we've seen in this pandemic is a new generation of lay leaders emerging. Lay people stepping up to take on responsibility in service, in worship, in pastoral care. And that's happened because we've had to return to the disciplines of prayer in our own homes. We can't go back to how things were. We need to honour and form this new generation of lay leaders. Because when lay people are really confident in discerning and using their gifts in church and in the world, then ministry really takes off. Then second, think about that parish. It's been fashionable in recent years to run down the parish, to assume it's part of the inherited old-fashioned furniture of church that needs sweeping away. But I think we've seen incredible agility in our parishes in recent months as they've stepped up and changed to respond to fast-changing circumstances. Now, of course, the parish in some ways will need to change. We'll need pioneers and plants where church life is weak. We need to perhaps reform some of the heavy legal structures that can make parish life feel perhaps sometimes a bit inflexible. But above all, we need a real pride in our parish structure, because whatever emerges, it will depend on the bedrock of parish life. Then third, think about that priest, busy, streaming away, even while he had to shield. This pandemic, for me, is demonstrating the need for a generation of priests who are at one and the same time sacramentally confident and evangelistically agile. Sacramentally confident because I think many people have found a real love for the sacraments in this lockdown, and we need priests able to respond to that, confident enough to invite people to meet with Jesus in the Eucharist. But at the same time, we know we need priests who can respond fast to a fast-changing evangelistic context, who can meet needs of the gospel. Priests inspired perhaps by people like Aidan and Cuthbert, priests able to be out on the road sharing the good news. But all of this, of course, makes us think about the central structures of the church and the kind of diocese that we're going to need in the future. And I think there's a debate there that we're not really quite having yet. There's a presumption that dioceses, in order to respond to straitened financial times, to reducing clergy numbers and to heightened evangelistic challenge, need to centralise. We need ever bigger central structures, more central teams, ever tighter central deployment strategies. My fear is that will actually weaken parish life and lead only to frustration and resentment. Perhaps there's another way. What is a diocese? Actually, a diocese is not an organisation. Bishops aren't CEO equivalents. A diocese is a Eucharistic network. Bishops are shepherds and pastors. Perhaps actually, rather than centralising, with that understanding, we could decentralise, seeing bishops as overseers and the chief evangelist, while the responsibility lies with the local church. Surely we need stronger parishes, more entrepreneurial leadership, parishes that will take responsibility not just for their own ministry, but for how they're going to pay for it as well. Perhaps we need to use central funds simply in order the church can go on thriving in deprived areas. I think the debate over the shape of the diocese is one that we really need to have. It seems to me this pandemic has revealed a nation looking for the ministry of the church. How are we going to respond to that? That's an absolutely critical question, because we need to be ready to risk everything in order to do so.
I'd like to offer 5 tips about partnership and collaborative working. I like to think they're 5 tips for the future. First one is that church is not just about Sunday. We've had 16 weeks without Sunday church, and I don't think it's damaged our faith or our discipleship that much. Maybe they've even flourished. But it does give us a clue about the future. Perhaps, just perhaps, we're learning that church is not just about Sundays. And if we can loosen the hold that Sunday worship has over us, we begin to see just how much scope there is for partnership and collaboration and fellowship, even if only via Zoom. So following on from this, my second point is that an outward focus is essential. An outward focus has always been essential, but now in the new normal, it's non-negotiable. So let's begin by dropping the Church's rather patronising way of using the term collaborative working. When I, as a layperson, hear collaborative working on the lips of an archdeacon or bishop, I know what they mean. It's let lay people do more to run the church, especially on Sundays. Well, not only have I come to resent my discipleship being labelled lay, I am increasingly determined that being a follower of Jesus, well, it's a lot more thrilling than running a church, even a growing church. Collaboration beyond the safety of church life really does give scope for the Holy Spirit to prompt and shape and enable grace to cascade. My third point, we can collaborate with others on the basis of Isaiah's vision of human flourishing. The Isaiah vision is in chapter 65. It goes that the children do not die, that old people live in dignity, those who build houses live in them, and those who plant vines receive the fruit of their labour. It was Raymond Fung way back in the 1980s who gave us this biblically based nudge towards partnership and collaboration. He urges us to work with anyone, regardless of faith or lack of it, who assents to the Isaiah vision of human flourishing. My fourth point is that Anglicans, our history and today, we bear the marks of privilege, and this mars our ability to work well with others. We're stained by privilege at a time when privilege is under scrutiny. So now is a kairos moment to let go of our perceived effortless superiority. The pandemic has helped us to see and feel vulnerability. We're stripped of familiar resources, so we are humbled. And maybe for the first time in our history, we understand the nature of humility which Jesus commands. When we shed privilege, we learn to welcome the solidarity of working with others. My fifth and final point is that we need now to refresh the 5 marks of mission that have guided the Anglican Communion for over 30 years. When a former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, has dared to say that time is up on the idea that the church is the official broker between people and God, then we know we've entered a new reality, and a reality that mocks the existing formulation of the marks of mission. So let me offer some new marks of mission. My first mark of mission would be that we should learn to be unafraid of reality and face up to the reality that for the vast majority, the trappings of the Church of England and what we do on Sundays have receded into history. My second mark of mission would be to build up neighbourhoods. This is sometimes referred to as placemaking, and it necessitates working with others to build up a positive sense of belonging, especially in neighbourhoods that are broken. My third new mark of mission is to create opportunities for people to hear themselves think, and then to gain the courage and skill to be able to think for themselves. The new jargon for this is to be woke. It means waking up to matters of concern and the often hidden structural injustices. This pandemic has made us deeply aware of our need to embrace an entirely new paradigm and to warm to the possibilities of collaboration, that will enable us to pull down long existing silos that have kept us apart. But how far will we dare to go? Dare we allow local churches to move away from our utterly centralised ecclesiastical system with its control and hierarchy and privilege?
Hi, it's Dr. Bex Lewis, who's Senior Lecturer in Digital Marketing at Manchester Metropolitan University, having a talk to you about using a screen for churches, what's happened during the lockdown and what that might mean, and some of the lessons we can take afterwards. So despite the notion that digital is easy and free and anyone can do it, people have said this about communications for years, it takes training, it takes resources, it takes intention, it takes learning to do it well. And so for lots of people at the beginning, we just threw a sermon online and said, right, we're doing online church. But that's not necessarily what it is. So we need to think about, what does church online look like? What does digital do differently? So rather than judging digital as deficient in some way to face and physical, think about what does it do differently and what does it allow us to do differently. What might we need to stop doing elsewhere to give space for it? There's been reports that there's large numbers of people engaging online. We need to think carefully about those numbers. May just be people church hopping, maybe the same old faces in different spaces, but it may be a sign that something different is going on. So for instance, I live in Manchester, but I've joined my old house group in Durham. I've been ill for the last 3 years, really. Not really managed physical church. I've managed to go pretty much every week during lockdown because I can go in my pyjamas if I want. So think about what do we do differently, and what might people's needs be that the digital can help us do. I'm not saying get rid of physical at all, but think about what does the digital let us do. And for many churches, I think the digital may provide what's known as a hyperlocal layer. So you have your physical activities and you think about how you lay a digital layer on top of that, thinking about what your church does, what its values are, so it makes sense. So one of the things I was thinking about in terms of mission or anything, it's important to think that what do individually and corporately, what does our church look like? So the digital presence can be an extension of this. I've given talks about the mix of personal and professional in online space, especially about my own cancer experience and how the self needs to be recognisable. And thinking back to when I did my first ever website for a church 10-15 years ago, one of the things we were keen on is that when people came to the church, there was no horrific big surprises. What was presented as the type of church it was online was recognisable when you walked in the door. So I'm looking for that kind of blend online. But now, of course, since then, we've got all these other tools. We've got social media, we've got Facebook, we've got Instagram. TikTok's a big one at the moment. I'm not sure any church has massively learned how to use that because it's a space for comedy and laughing and dancing and slightly wacky stuff. But the online really gives us a space to be 24/7 alongside each other, supporting each other, sharing our ways of living. And it moves us beyond time and geography in lots of ways to engage. So I think church leaders have got a powerful place to encourage us to think about how the online functions and how we interact online. I've run lots of workshops with people where people say, I don't do technology, I'm scared of technology. But I think particularly with social media, if we take the emphasis away from the word media and think about social and think about how we engage, and how we interact with each other, then that's much more important, and the technology can then become a bit less scary because we're getting it to do what we want rather than thinking, I have to do this and I have to do that. So think about how do we connect, communicate and share our lives. Digital is so ubiquitous we often fail to question it, but one of my favourite verses is the Message version of Romans 12:1-2, where it says, take your ordinary everyday lives, give them to God, and for me digital is part of that, but don't become so embedded you don't ask questions of it. And I think church leaders in particular can help us think about how we think about legislation and how we challenge companies to be accountable for how they do this better. Galatians around the fruits of the Spirit is the other bit I tend to get people to think about. What does it mean to be patient online when people quite often have trigger fingers? Overall, however, I think there's no one way to do digital church. We need to experiment, we need to talk to each other, see what isn't working for us, and think about how we can improve church, but also wider society. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Kate Wharton. I'm a vicar in Liverpool, and I wrote the article about relationships. Whatever our relationships look like, I think the lockdown has affected all of us, hasn't it, in all sorts of different ways, whether we live alone or with other people, whether we're single or married, whether we have children or don't have children, whatever our friendship circles look like, we've all been affected relationally by this period in which it's not been possible for us to see other people in a normal kind of way. I'm single and I live alone, and I'm also a massive extrovert, and so I've struggled to be on my own so much more than normal during this time. I found that really unusual. It's not always been an easy time for me. For others, the challenges will have been different, but as I say, I think in some way all of us will have been affected because the ways we normally interact with people, the people we normally engage with, all of those things will have had to look different. In terms of priorities, we were asked to give 3, and the first of mine was a huge goal. I knew that as I wrote it, and it was to imagine what it might look like if loneliness was eradicated from our society. Like I say, I know that's a massive kind of goal, but wouldn't it be a wonderful thing to aim for? Loneliness, I think, is a huge blight on our society today. Surveys, again and again, whether they're in the church or outside or whatever age group, surveys seem to show so many people are struggling with loneliness. And I think for a while we've perhaps been aware of that in older people. We've perhaps perceived that that might be an issue as people age and are less able to be out and about, but we're beginning to see that it's also something which hugely affects young people as well. More and more young people are self-identifying as being lonely. So it seems to be the case that whatever your age, whatever your background, loneliness is something which is hugely affecting people. And I'd love to see this be tackled and challenged in some way within the church. What might it look like for us to do community better? What might it look like for us to support one another better? What might it look like for us to be there for one another in more concrete ways which do something to mitigate against this dreadful problem of loneliness? My second priority was a desire that we might in some way see friendships which look more mixed, more variable. Inevitably, many of us gravitate in terms of friendship towards those people who look like us, sound like us, do the sort of job we do or have the sort of interest that we do. Of course, those are our friends because that's how we meet them, and they're familiar because they're a little bit like us. That's inevitable. There's nothing wrong with that, of course. But perhaps we could all look a little bit more widely at our friendships and not necessarily rule out those who are not so much like us. One tiny example we've seen of that here at my church during lockdown, one of my favourite lockdown stories, is that leading up to Easter, we decided to ask all of our young children to do an Easter card for one of our older people. And so I did the kind of matching up, and the children produced the cards, we posted them, and the elderly people received those cards for Easter, and they were delighted. They were, overwhelmed by it because, of course, you can imagine how beautiful and creative these cards were. And what we've seen in some cases, of course, the older people wanted to know which child had made their card, and they didn't necessarily know each other because they were from different church services. And so in some cases, we've seen the older people write to the children, and some of them have become pen pals and are looking forward to meeting in person. That's just one example, of course, friendship spanning age. But what a beautiful example, what an example for us all to follow. My third priority was a desire that we might all increase in kindness and empathy as lockdown ends. I'm a huge fan of social media, but gosh, can't it sometimes be a place lacking in grace, lacking in understanding? I would love to think that as lockdown progresses and ends, that we would see an increase in love and grace and kindness in the way we treat each other, the way we look out for one another, the way we love and support each other. Those are my 3 priorities in the area of relationships. I look forward to continuing the conversation.
That's a fascinating start to our conversation. We've got about half an hour. Thank you to everybody who's been signing in on the YouTube chat. I've been keeping an eye on that. We've got about 300 plus people talking about loneliness and specifically, and also about the need for mixed relationships. That struck me very strongly. One of the things that makes a relationship and why we go with people like ourselves is because of shared experience. And this is one of the things that the pandemic has given us. It's given us a very similar set of experiences. When we get to peacetime, as I like to think of it, how can we reproduce that sort of shared experience?
Yeah, it's a great question, isn't it? I mean, it's an interesting thing to think about as how we make friends, isn't it, as adults? Because children know how to make friends. You know, my friends' kids, my godchildren, you turn your back for a moment and they've just made friends with a child in a playground or in the street. They've got this knack about it, and we lose it as adults. We don't know how. We get nervous about meeting new people or making friends. And there's, in this aspect, as in so many aspects of our lives, there's probably a lot we can learn from children. But you're right that this strange time that we've lived through and are living through has given us a shared experience. And I also think that church gives us an enormous amount of shared experience, doesn't it? And I think church, when it's doing it right, brings together these really different types of people that wouldn't normally necessarily meet or mix with each other. And it's one of the absolute joys, I think, about church is that we do get this mix of ages and backgrounds and life circumstances and experiences, and people kind of turn up together on a Sunday. At the moment, they turn up online, or sometimes they turn up in real life, and we have an opportunity to be friends with different kinds of people. And so I would hope that, you know, our experience of church, our experience of lockdown, certainly those things are shared experiences that we can bring as we make friends, and perhaps as well something of, not that we only have to talk about this time, of course, heaven forbid, hopefully we'll have lots of other things to talk about, but simply having lived through something so enormous together, as not just as a country, but as the whole world. Hopefully that in itself might even make us more open to the possibility of new friends.
Okay, thank you. That really leads on to Bex, because Kate naturally falls into the conversation about meeting people on a Sunday. And one of the questions that's come through is about Christianity being an embodied faith, not only our relationship with the embodied God, but with each other. And yet, that's one of the key difficulties with a digital relationship. How do you answer that conundrum?
For me, it's about being present. So you can be physically present and mentally absent, and you can be online. And for me, being online is being physical. I may be sat in front of a screen, but I'm here with a body. I'm using a keyboard, I'm using a mouse to engage, I'm using my brain. So when I'm online, I want to be 100% present with whatever I'm doing online, the same as if I was in an offline activity. So I'm not saying it's the same as a physical thing, but I think quite often we prioritise the physical in a way. There's a really good quote from Sonia Livingstone about how we judge every form of mediated communication against face-to-face as if it's supposed to do the same job, whereas actually it's potentially doing something different. And particularly for me, the last 3 years, I've essentially been in different forms of lockdown, having chemotherapy and things like that, where I've not been able to see people because my immune system is suppressed. And so having online relationships where I feel like I've got to know people really well, I've got to know people really well in depth, And one of the things I thought was quite interesting, I used to be a trip leader for Oakhall Holidays, and on the trip there'd be certain people that I'd get to know really well and think, oh, these are the people I'm probably going to stay friends with. And then people would connect with you on Facebook and you'd have a completely different set of people that I'm still friends with 10 years later. So it's a kind of different kind of connection. And I think if we can stop measuring it against things, Andrew Greystone's doing a PhD on the place of touch in a digital age. And I have to say, when I got another negative diagnosis last week, and what I wanted was a hug. And so I went to my bubble family and got a hug because that's what I really needed. So it's I think if we think about how, like Poole, he wrote letters to other people. He didn't physically go to preach to them. So he used the communication method of the time, which was not an embodied one. It was on paper. So I think I find that, hopefully that answers some of that.
That's good. That's good. Anne Morisy, you managed to squeeze several truths into your into your talk. One that, but my overall impression, though, was about throughout what you were saying. You're talking about slicing away things that we take for granted that are attached to church, and what came out from me really was you were presenting an argument for leaving church altogether.
Yes. Yes.
Right. Could we put that a little more positively?
Well, yes, because I think we have some stepping stones to help us do that. And I actually think we have a possible destination that we can hold to guide our steps in this stripping. In some ways, historically, Methodism did it for us a couple of centuries ago, and we walked past what Methodism was offering to us. But I'm very interested in some of the non-centralized efforts at discipleship. And I know I'm not talking church when I talk discipleship, but if church doesn't facilitate a deep and committed and exciting discipleship, then what is it about? And I look to some of the placemaking initiatives associated with, say, urban expression or the Eden initiatives, and even some of the church army initiatives, where people are committed to their place and committed to their Christian practice. And if we look to those, I then can actually evaluate what, in fact, the Church of England offers to, in inverted commas, lay people. And I really, in some ways, putting Bishop Philip's contribution alongside my own, you would see that difference in emphasis. But when a parish church over media, socially distant media, begins to offer a parochial church meeting, and the archdeacon's contribution is, have you revised your electoral roll? You start to realize all these accretions which we have gathered over time and are desperately in need of freeing us up. Things that are good enough will be sufficient, rather than this monitoring and assessing and really controlling. So yes, let's use this as an opportunity for something new, and it will be most painful for those who have a formal role within the church, and that means much of the clergy.
Good. Well, there's my link to the next speaker, Bishop Philip North. And one of the things about the post-pandemic thinking is people are very good at thinking about how other people should change. And I noticed in one of the things that you talked about changing the diocese. Now, of all the speakers here, you are not a diocesan bishop, but you are nevertheless meshed into the diocesan setup. So you're saying dioceses should change. So how should they change? What would you stop doing? Which of your diocesan responsibilities would you set aside?
Most of them. I mean, they'd change rather in some ways along the lines that Anne was suggesting, actually. When most people refer to the diocese, it's very interesting to think about what they mean. Because what they mean is actually the Diocesan Board of Finance. They mean this administrative structure that we created about 100 years ago, and which has been a thoroughgoing evangelistic catastrophe. In 100 years' time, in 2026, we'll be celebrating the centenary of the Diocese of Blackburn. That's 100 years of uninterrupted evangelistic failure. And we've created this monster at the centre that sucks up so much of our life and so much of our energy. And the response to our problems in the local church is ever greater centralisation, ever more central posts, ever greater scrutiny of the local church. Now, what I'd love us to explore is whether there's a completely different way of doing it, so that responsibility, rather than sitting in a half-hearted way with the central structure, actually sits with the local. So, what should a diocese be? In the early church, the bishop was the overseer of the local church. When they got too big, that bishop would give permission to presbyters, so they would have the authority to celebrate the mysteries for smaller churches. So it's a Eucharistic network. It's a network of relationships, not a charitable company, but a network of Eucharistic relationships. Perhaps I think it'll probably be forced on us that we need to recover that. We need to decentralize quite radically. We need to give responsibility back to the local church. So the bishop becomes much more the overseer, the pastor, and the roving evangelist. Now, I think if we don't do that, DBS are going to start collapsing anyway. It'll be forced upon us. But the challenge would be, of course, to Anne, is with that, actually, it may not be the clergy who suffer. The clergy might well flourish in that. The people who are risk suffering are local people in local churches if they're not viable, if they're not financially viable. Because at the moment, we prop up a lot of struggling churches. And that's where the questions start to ask. In particular, how to enable the urban church to flourish in that kind of decentralized structure.
Yeah.
Okay. Anne, would you like to come back on that, in fact?
Only to agree that it will be local small congregations that will be without. And of course, that will be across denominations. So the coming together, and often we do come together when we all feel weak. But the difficulty is that as Christians, we carry our homes on our back, in that we all have these buildings that I think we might have to be given permission to walk away from. The Church of Scotland did that in the 1980s, particularly in poor areas, having built monstrous flat-roofed concrete structures which were not viable. So Christians just left the building. And I think giving people permission to leave the building across denominations may be great liberation.
We are missing John Inge today because he was going to be contributing. He wrote the article about buildings, but I'm seeing questions coming up in the chat, so please keep them coming, about what do we do about buildings, and this is not just the burden of the clergy. It's quite often it's the burden of church wardens, and that's in one of the reasons why we have funds zooming around from the centre to the outer regions of the church, and is in order to keep these buildings going. And yet they're also the bit of the church that a lot of non-churchgoers are most attracted to. Any of you, some suggestions about how the building problem can be solved?
The first thing I would say is to avoid simplistic responses like, let's get rid of all these buildings, because they can be the most tremendous gift and the most tremendous gem, particularly if in some cases they're just allowed to be beautiful, ravishing, wonderful places of prayer. that can be powerfully attractional. In other places, they can be amended and adjusted to be places of community service. Buildings used imaginatively are, I think, a wonderful, wonderful gift. In other places, they can be a burden around a congregation's neck. It's one of those things where there is not a solution. There's as many local solutions as there are buildings. And I think key to it all is allowing local communities to engage with their buildings, throwing them open, getting them used, cutting off the privatisation of the building or the building as the clubhouse, and allowing local people really to love and engage with the space.
Bex, you've been existing without a building to go to, or without the ability to go to a building. How does that feel personally to you?
It's a struggle sometimes. So I think because when I moved to Manchester, I did the kind of bouncing around lots of different churches. And when I got my cancer diagnosis, I hadn't really entirely settled in one. I've been going to a small church in Levenshulme for about 8 weeks, but didn't feel like I was quite there yet. And then I just stopped going. So that causes a challenge. So I think, where Kate was talking about engaging, there's as much a mental problem sometimes in trying to find a church as there is a physical one. And I found it quite exciting, actually, the last few weeks. When lockdown first came, I was in New Zealand, but I was thinking, I can join all these churches, then totally overwhelmed by the 12 million options available all at once. And then I've just found some that are a bit shorter. So the people who've been playing with different ways of doing things, and I think it is recognising that the digital comes with a different cost. So you've got a building cost, but you've also got technology costs, and it's whether one ends up giving way to another because it's what the local community needs. And one of the things I really see about online is you can live lives online amongst each other. So having got properly involved back in the church, so the church I go to is actually a URC church in a decommissioned Anglican building, which has been turned into a space which does things like meals for the homeless, yoga classes, all that kind of stuff, and really heavily used building right in the middle of a little urban space. But being able to attend in my pyjamas 2 minutes after I've woken up is something else from someone who used to go to church in my best clothes on a Sunday. So it's finding a different way of doing it and having and enjoying watching the opportunity for people to gain confidence to do it themselves, which sometimes can be extra pressure for the minister trying to kind of edit everyone together. But sometimes as people gain confidence, I think you can possibly see some of the pressure go from the minister allowing the congregation to flourish and be part of that space, which I think is happening physically anyway. My mum lives in an area where it's a rural area where the minister has 7 churches and she basically runs their local church, but she's not ordained or a reader or anything.
Okay, thank you. I want to tell the speakers that what's happening at the moment is fantastic conversations are going on down the chats. So we'll talk amongst ourselves, but I think the main conversation is going on elsewhere. But I'm picking out one or two things. And one of the things which I want to ask Kate is partly related to what Bex has been saying, in that online, it's one of the most important things that I pick up from the Bible. I keep being reminded is God being no respecter of persons, which in modern translation means almost the opposite, in fact. But the key thing is that the type of person is not important to God. And how can we make a church where the type of person, I mean age, I mean children, people are asking how children could be part of the shaping the future. What about old people who have been shut away from their buildings and therefore are not being heard anymore? How can these voices feed into how the church is developed?
Well, like I said before, I mean, I think that's when church is at its best for me. That's my favourite sort of church. You know, if I go to a church that doesn't have a fascinating, complicated, messy mix of people. I sort of want to know why not. You know, it's my favourite kind of church. It doesn't matter how big it is necessarily, but to have that mix, and to have those people who never normally in any other sort of walk of life would be sitting next to each other. That's when I think we're doing it right. And whether we're in a building or whether we're online, I think that's still possible. But what we are seeing, you know, as Bex was kind of saying, what we are seeing with the online world at the moment is perhaps we're seeing even more people being able to join that mix than we were missing before. And I think we're realising some of the categories of people, I guess, the people that weren't part of the mix before that we've learned now, and hopefully therefore will become part of the mix. Because I think we're learning all sorts of things, aren't we? We're learning that at such time, even as we go back to doing church in person, we can't lose what we've gained while we've been doing it online. We need somehow to have a mix of those. We've found that, you know, Bex has told us about the fact that she's not been able necessarily to go physically to a church for the last few years, and that's one reason. But there's lots of other reasons why people might not have been able to or wanted to do that. We've had somebody join our church every week who, through a variety of mental health issues, hasn't had the confidence to come into the building, but she's joined us for worship every week, texted me as soon as the service finished, been in conversation. And the other thing that I've noticed, the way we've done our services, up until now we've done pre-recorded services, so we've been asking different people to contribute at home. You know, would you record some prayers and send them to us? Would you record the reading and send them to us? We put them together. We're finding people confident to join in a way that they wouldn't necessarily have been in church. So people who never would have agreed to stand up in church and do the intercessions have said, oh yeah, I could record that for you on a video at home. Suddenly they're in the church service leading, and, you know, enabling others to feel perhaps I could do it as well. So I think there are things about people's confidence to join in that we're also noticing all the time. And I think that can only be positive. Different people that wouldn't have come before, people doing things they wouldn't have done before. All of those are real positives from this time.
But to pick up Anne's point about being outward looking, that also, I presume, Anne, means outward going. And we did set you one of the most difficult tasks in the articles, which is to write about collaboration, which in itself is not a thing, and yet it's one of the most important aspects of how we might progress. And one of the aspects I'm particularly interested, again, picking up from Kate's point about wanting mixed relationships. I think a lot of types of people of different ethnicities, different faiths that they don't normally come across in the church. And often, because church is so absorbing in any circle at all that they're in, or have been up until now. Tell us a little bit more, and we're getting a little short of time, but quite briefly about the placemaking that you mentioned.
Placemaking. Well, I described it in my article is helping people and encouraging people to have something to say after they have said hello. So picking up Kate's comment about how is it that we make friends? Well, we can maintain an acquaintance quite successfully by nodding, but at some point we need to say something which is a disclosure. And that's one of my disappointments with Sunday by Sunday church as we have construed it, is that there is no place for disclosure. That's why I like to think of Alcoholics Anonymous as the real church. So if I illustrate something from Oldham, from one of the Eden projects there, what they did when it snowed, as it does a lot in Oldham, isn't that right, Philip? That they decided to have a barbecue. And just that rather perverse action created spectacle. And of course, the kids were all around enjoying the barbecue, but so were people tweaking at their windows, tweaking their curtains. And so the kids were then invited to knock on every door. What do you want from the barbecue? And so a sense of identity was created by that one imaginative act. which is why I say this outward looking, not just with action, but certainly prior to the action, with an extraordinary imagination in order to create these lines of memorability, positive memories, where people say, this is a good and interesting place in which to live. And from there, a host of positives can flow.
Thank you. Thank you. We haven't got a great deal of time. We've got about 5 minutes more. Anne, one of the words you used in your earlier presentation was humble, humility. You think that this experience has humbled the church. I'd like to ask each of you for personal experience of is there something in the last 3 months or so which has been humbling and therefore revealing? Philip, I'm going to ask you first.
You certainly need warning of that question, didn't you?
Yeah, sorry.
Can I just very quickly come back to Anne first of all, because I love the Oldham story, but I kind of want to know where Christ fits into it.
Oh, right.
And I think we're outward-looking community in and for him. Mm-hmm. And I think we can sometimes forget that, actually. And the need to, I suppose one thing lockdown shows is that the need, we're going to need to serve desperately and build community desperately, but it must be Christ-like and Christ-centered. Indeed. And that's where worship places Jesus right at the centre. Reminds us that. Philip,
stop. Let Anne answer that. She's shaking her head, but let's.
Well, I really have to defend the Eden Project because it probably was the most Christian, extended, diverse group. So who's the best phlebotomist? A former drug addict. How does that drug addict maintain his poise? Through the practice of prayer. So I really just have to defend that the Eden Project, perhaps more than any, encourages people to explore who Jesus is and how to follow Jesus. And that certainly community action, which is not about reflection and people thinking about profound things about themselves and the world, is not community engagement at all.
Thank you. Philip, that was a very successful time waster, but I'm still going to ask you about a humbling experience.
2 very quick ones. One was being grilled to within an inch of my life in front of his primary school online by a 9-year-old called Caleb, asking the most searching questions and putting me thoroughly in my place. And the second has been worshipping on my own. And in particular, keeping the Easter vigil all alone in the night before Easter. And it's quite a long service, and I did it at great length. And as it came to its climax, I suddenly felt powerfully not alone. I suddenly felt the presence of the universal church and the presence of the saints with an intensity that I've never known in my life before, and a sense of the presence of the risen Christ and his power in my life. It was very, very extraordinary.
Thank you. Kate, how about you?
Yeah, I've been pondering the question as Philip was talking. It's a tricky question, isn't it? I'll probably think of 12 better answers as soon as we've stopped. And I'm sorry that the answer I'm going to give isn't a more positive one in a way, but I have really, really found this a tough time. And I think for me, my answer has to be just an awareness of the fact that it's not that I didn't know this, but I just can't do this on my own, life or faith or anything. And it isn't that I didn't know that. And actually, it's probably a good thing to have learned and been reminded of. But it's easy in my normal life for me to kid myself of my self-sufficiency. I do all right at being single. I live on my own. I lead my church. Life's kind of good. It's busy. But I have found it extraordinarily difficult to manage lockdown on my own. I have felt very, very lonely and isolated, and it's been hard. And I've needed people. I've needed to relearn, as Philip just mentioned, ways to worship by myself.
Kate, thank you.
I've learned a lot about what I've needed.
Thank you. Bex, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, mine kind of fits quite well with what Kate just said, because I've just found this a sort of slightly longer extension of being alone quite a lot before. But I mean, I was stuck in New Zealand when lockdown came, and all the flights stopped, and I wasn't sure when I was going to get home. And one of the big things that people have done for me, not necessarily just Christian friends, but friends in general, were kind of taking it in turns to ring me and keep my mental health sane whilst I was stuck overseas, not quite sure what was going to happen. So, and that, a lot of that has translated into kind of practical support as I was coming back, making sure my car was ready.
Thank you. Kate,
yeah.
Bex, I'm going to stop you there because we're running out of time, but I want to hear from Anne just for 10 seconds.
Capacity to waste time and capacity to overeat. It's very humbling.
Thank you. All right. Well, I will contribute my own humility, which you will have spotted, anybody who was at the start, that my inability to cope with technology has come out yet again. But also humbling has been to see how fantastic your contributions have been on the chat, with not just questions, but conversations between each other. And please keep those coming. We have a 5-minute break now, and then it all starts again with a fresh set of people, a fresh amount of energy and excitement. It's a hugely complicated thing that we're trying to do, and I want to thank our speakers today for the bravery in which they've expressed the ideas and the vision for a church and a world that we can only start grasping towards. So thank you very much for all of you. Thank you. And stay with us, everybody who's out there. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Ed Thornton, Assistant Editor of the Church Times. Welcome to part 2 of this Church Times webinar, looking at the question, what are the lessons of the pandemic? We hope you enjoyed the first part. It certainly seemed like a lively discussion. The first part of the webinar focused on the lessons of the pandemic for church and ministry. In this second part, we're broadening things out a bit to look at what lessons can be learnt for wider society, both here and internationally. I'm delighted to be joined by 4 of the writers who contributed to our recent post-pandemic issue of the Church Times. That was the 26th of June issue. They are the Reverend Dr. Sharon Prentis. She is the Intercultural Mission Enabler and Dean of Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic Affairs in Birmingham Diocese. She's also Honorary Research Fellow at the Edward Cadbury Centre for the Public Understanding of Religion at the University of Birmingham. And she's also recently been appointed Canon Theologian of Lichfield Cathedral. Our next guest is Hugh Williamson, who is Director of the Europe and Central Asia Division in Berlin. Before joining Human Rights Watch, Hugh worked for 11 years as a correspondent from the Manila and Berlin bureaus of the Financial Times. Our next guest is Dr. Poole. She's the 3rd Church Estates Commissioner, though she wrote for us in the issue in a personal capacity. Her books include Leader Smithing, Revealing the Trade Secrets of Leadership, and Buying God, Consumerism and Theology. And finally, we have Harry Baker, who is a full-time poet and the World Poetry Slam champion, as well as one half of the comedy rap jazz duo Harry and Chris. Harry's show The Sunshine Kid was voted Best Spoken Word Show of the 2015 Edinburgh Fringe. Now, as in the first section, each of our guests today have recorded short videos in advance, summarising what some of their arguments were in the post-pandemic issue. So we're going to watch those first, and once we've seen those, we'll return here for conversation and questions. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so in the comments feed on the YouTube channel, or use our hashtag CTWhat'sNext, or email marketing@churchtimes.co.uk. And just to remind you, the Church House Bookshop has a special offer on books by some of our speakers or on themes related to what we're talking about, and that offers 20%. But first, let's turn to the videos that each of our contributors have recorded.
One of the significant issues that the pandemic has uncovered is the uncomfortable truth that the social and economic inequality in Britain is widening. Emerging evidence indicates that those on a low income, older people, those living with disabilities, and people of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic heritages are the worst affected. Welfare agencies are reporting a significant increase in the demand for their services. For example, debt charities have seen a substantial rise in the numbers of people borrowing money to buy even the basics. The debt charity Step Change has estimated that since the beginning of lockdown, 1.2 million people have fallen behind on their utility bill payments. Another 820,000 people owe council tax, and around 500,000 people are behind on their rent. Food banks have seen a significant increase in the numbers of users. The pandemic has further compounded and highlighted the deepening chasm between those that have the means to live and those whose daily existence is a struggle. The economic forecasts are that the impact of the pandemic will be with us for some time to come. Yet during this time, the Church has been an active participant in the mutual aid networks that have proliferated and come into their own. Through a number of programs and social support schemes, the Church has literally shown what it is to love your neighbour. Pope Francis recently said, "The gospel of the marginalised is where our credibility is found and revealed. It is where total openness to serving others is our hallmark. It alone is our title of honour. In years to come, when people look for the church, my hope is that they will find it amongst the poor. They will find it being representative of members of all those individuals who are not traditionally regarded as having influence. That they will find it orientated towards the brokenness we find in society. This new orientation to those outside has reinforced a sense of missional purpose through service. However, the social programs that have been developed or come into their own through the church will need to be reviewed. They will need to be sustained and will need to adapt to the changing context in the future. If they don't, they will cease to exist. And the activism that has so much underpinned them will always be needed. One of the harsh realities of this time is that we are confronted with not just one pandemic, but three. The coronavirus, systemic racism, and the global environmental crisis. All these three are disproportionately affecting poorer individuals, people of colour, and those living with disabilities. So as we emerge, there are several challenges ahead. As we come to appreciate the economic and social impact, the Church's call, therefore, is to stand up for righteousness and justice. And this means showing the love of God, standing up against structural inequalities of all kinds, to speak out against racism, and at the same time to critically deconstruct narratives of privilege and power. This is not just an external matter, but it's an internal one, which effectively influences the Church's ability to minister in society. What we want is a church that is representative of all people.
Hello, I'm Hugh Williamson and I work for Human Rights Watch, the human rights organisation in Berlin. Thanks for the chance to join this event. My topic is the double challenge facing governments. First, to respond to the pandemic in ways that protect public health and human rights. And second, to look to the future, to implement policies that, so to speak, build back better, so the world after the pandemic is fairer and more sustainable than the one before. The pandemic has certainly been a vast challenge, not only for citizens like us, but also for governments. Getting the balance right between swift action to control the spread of the virus and ensuring that people's basic rights are respected has been really difficult. It's been important for governments to protect vulnerable groups such as older people and to use emergency powers only as exceptions to the rule. Some governments have clearly not done this. They've used the pandemic as an excuse to arrest people who raise concerns about the virus or to increase surveillance of the public. One clear feature of the pandemic has been the way around the world it has brought to the surface disturbing patterns of structural inequality and disadvantage that we knew about, but were not always a strong focus of attention. Government needs to focus on these issues in their short-term responses and create policies that dismantle these structures as they build back better. 3 quick examples. Women have in many ways borne the brunt of the pandemic. It's been women who are doing many of the vital but low-paid frontline jobs, and women who are taking on more of the caregiving. The threat of domestic violence against women and children has also increased. Second, the fault lines between rich and poor in many societies have been fully exposed in recent months. That food banks show this. Unless these fault lines are addressed, the poor will continually suffer, also in future waves of the pandemic. Third, patterns of discrimination have been laid bare. The fact that the pandemic death rates among Black people in the UK and the US are higher than among white people is shocking. This is another long overdue wake-up call for government and for our societies, reinforced, of course, by the Black Lives Matter movement. What other policies should governments be addressing together to build back better for the long term? So far, joint efforts in this direction have been decidedly patchy, with many governments choosing national approaches over international cooperation, but more cooperation certainly is needed. The search for a vaccine is a case in point. Despite some countries taking a nationalist approach, scientists argue that international work is vital for the speedy development of a safe, effective vaccine. And there were some good initiatives in this direction. Finally, many governments have launched huge economic programs to help companies recover after the pandemic. A core part of these should be investing in our environmental future by promoting the shift away from fossil fuels to renewables to address climate change. Also here, there are some signs of good practice. These are just a few initial thoughts. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and the discussion.
So what might the future of work be post-COVID? Of course, it's all very speculative and we don't really know, but in my article for the Church Times, I looked at different sorts of collar colour as a way of trying to get some clues. So I think most of us are aware of the differentiation between white collar and blue collar traditionally, with white collar being office jobs and blue collar jobs being more in manufacturing and frontline services. And it's true to say that white collar jobs are likely to be temporarily affected, I think, by contractions in the economy, but because they're quite transferable and most of the people doing them can work from home, they may be more resilient than other kinds of jobs. Blue collar, particularly key workers, we have a fresh appreciation of exactly what it is that they do for us all. But again, they are in a lot of careers that will be vulnerable to any recession that we have. I then talked about pink collar, which is about women. It depends a little bit on how quickly schooling resumes, and if it does resume in full in the autumn, that may help. But certainly during the crisis, women have had to often take the bulk of the childcare and homeschooling burden, and have often had to take reduced hours at work as a result, so haven't fared so well. That may, of course, affect their ability to progress and to be paid equitably going forward too. I then talked about some other collar jobs that you can read about in the Church Times and focused on the uncollared, the youth, because we have a real problem looming there and one that I really want to focus on because it is so problematic. So even before this crisis, unemployment for those under the age of 24 was at about 10%, which is really dreadful. And probably about a third of all those who are employed under the age of 25 are working in professions and employers who've been particularly badly hit by lockdown. A lot of commentators are predicting at least a 20% unemployment rate at that level. And of course, an awful lot of these people have never even had a job yet, so they haven't got on the career ladder and now there isn't one available to them. So this is the reason that people like Andy Haldane from the Bank of England have been suggesting a national citizen sort of civic service, a bit like national service used to be, but not military, much more to do with youth training schemes and work experience, as a way of just trying to create opportunities for a generation that we might otherwise lose. One of the suggestions that I made in an earlier article in the Church Times, though, was about a year of universal basic income. And that's for a variety of reasons. It's not just about giving young people a cushion so that they have some time to develop some training and skills that they will need for getting employment. It's also about getting rid of food banks entirely by guaranteeing a certain amount of money for everyone to be able to shop for the food and basics that they need. It would allow people who do have some disposable income to use the universal basic income to generate some savings to help cushion them from any life circumstances that may otherwise knock them off track. And it would allow the middle classes to immediately donate their universal basic income to help the charity sector, which of course is in meltdown. It would also allow the workers in the cultural industries that have been so badly affected to be able to keep practicing their professions while those industries recover. And it feels like it would be the best possible policy intervention to guarantee dignity to the maximum number of people, particularly if it was a one-year pilot to really test the concept and understand what the intended and unintended consequences of that would be. And particularly writing as a Christian, I would think it's a particularly Christian thing to do because it is unconditional and it is about dignity and about love. We don't decide to turn people away from A&E because they're not the deserving sick. So why do we not want to help the poor by deciding that there are some people that deserve handouts and some people that don't? So it feels to me that universal basic income would be a particularly useful policy manoeuvre to protect us as we go through the next few months. And lastly, the other thing I talk about in my article is the role of the churches in this. We have a huge number of very qualified, articulate, experienced people who could be doing more to understand and support people in their own congregations and communities who are struggling at the moment, either because they need to make a transition from one workplace to another, or because they lack some skills they need to be able to get into the workplace in the first place. So I would really like to see some really creative schemes in the parishes about how we might use all of the expertise that is resident within our communities just to share that about more equitably. So it's not a very positive picture, but I do think that we have some ideas about how we could improve it, and I think the churches will be a vital part of that. I look forward to our discussion.
Hello, my name is Harry Baker. I'm a full-time poet. I wrote an article for the post-pandemic issue of the Church Times on creativity in the arts. What's going to happen next? Who knows? What's a possibility? What's an inevitability? If you've not read the article, what have you been doing with your lives? But just to summarise, it's now been 113 days since I last did a gig on a stage in front of people, but who's counting? There was a sense of camaraderie, of gallows humour. The quote I remember from that night was, even if we're only ever allowed to do gigs to 10 people in the audience, at least most poetry nights will be unaffected. And I think one thing I saw as lockdown continued was that people turned to art, whether it was as creators, finding writing or drawing, having more time for these hobbies if they'd been furloughed, whether it was as consumers thinking, actually, we need something to escape from this constant barrage of being told how many people are dying around the world. I think there's a quote that sums it up nicely for me, is that Cesar Cruz, a Mexican poet, said, art should comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. I know I've seen Banksy use that quote as well. Maybe I'm Banksy. And to begin with, it felt like we'd all been disturbed. We were only allowed out of the house for an hour a day. We weren't allowed to hug our friends. And the poem of mine that had been most shared in this time is called When This Is Over, and it is imagining that next time you can hug a loved one. But I think what's also important and exciting, dare I say it, is the idea of the other half of that. How do we disturb the comfortable? You know, this virus that doesn't discriminate has affected various communities more dramatically, more devastatingly than others. A lot of inequality in society has been heightened by this, and so how do we imagine this fairer world? How do we shake up the status quo so that that's possible? There have been sparks of hope. I think the way that online gigs have been made pretty much accessible to anyone with an internet connection. The pay what you want model means that those who can afford it can help fund an artist creating something for those who can't. I think accessibility in the arts beforehand has always felt like a notional gesture that maybe doesn't have fully effective measures around it the whole time. So if we're building another future, how can we continue that? I think another thing that's been exciting for me as an artist has been setting up a Ko-fi page. People have Patrons as well, where it's not just, can I buy a ticket for your show, or can I buy your book? You know, can I give you money in return for a thing? But people are donating to keep artists going because they see what you do as worthwhile. Your existence in itself is something that society needs. I think the other thing is, how can we imagine that future? I think the idea of not knowing where my gigs are coming from has always been a reality of being an artist. This has just heightened it. And I think we have created and we have dreamt, despite what's going on around us. So even though in the last 10 years funding to the Arts Council has been cut dramatically, there are still people creating incredible stuff. So I think whatever happens, even in my bleakest dystopian despair, I believe art will prosper and eventually thrive. Since writing that, there started to be announced that various theatres were closing. I was worried I'd been too hopeful, but this week there was announced a £1.57 billion payout for the arts. I don't know who that's going to trickle down to, but that has been much campaigned for, much hoped for, and so hopefully there's a sense that at least someone somewhere thinks it's worth it. But yeah, I'm happy to talk more, answer any questions, stick up for my thoughts.
Thank you very much for all those videos. Absolutely fascinating. Just a reminder, if you want to post questions, do so in our YouTube channel or at #CTWhat'sNext, or emailing marketing@churchtimes.co.uk. Something that struck me from those video talks and from the articles that you all wrote was a real theme that I think has come through, is that this pandemic, as Sharon Prentis so eloquently said in her article, while the virus does not discriminate, its impact does. And it seems there's a thread through all of what you've said about inequality. It's showing up inequality, but also the impact on certain communities in society not being equal. Sharon, if I just turn to you first. You spoke in your video about how the pandemic has further highlighted and compounded the deepening chasm between those who have the means to live and those whose daily existence is a struggle. I'm sure many would agree with that analysis. I was wondering what you think might need to be done at a sort of policy level in government to address this inequality.
I think what it's done is it's highlighted something that's always been there and has, for a lot of policy, even though it's sought to address shortening that difference between people, it actually hasn't. Years of austerity have gradually eroded the real income people have. And so policy will have, if we were looking at doing something radical, it would be about making sure that everybody has the means to live well. What we're seeing now is that there is an underclass, if you can call that. There is a definite class, a group of people who are not able to access the means to live well like everybody else. And so what we are talking about is a pretty radical shake-up of our welfare policies, as well as challenging some of the structural inequality that doesn't allow people to access good education, good health, a good means to make a living, all those things that challenge people's ability to live well.
Thank you. You also spoke in your video about the social programs that churches carry out. You talk about them needing to be renewed, sustained, and adapt to changing context in the future. And if they don't, they will cease to exist. It's a very serious situation you identify. I mean, what would some of the practical ways be that you suggest social programs could adapt?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think social programs are fantastic, and what we've seen are churches come to the fore in the mutual aid network. You know, we've seen this huge rise of communities come together to support local people. But on the one hand, that's been fantastic, but there's also the advocacy that's required. We have to question why people are in this situation in the first place. And so I find in my particular context, churches are coming to the realization that not only is it about supporting people and providing means for people to live, but about challenging the structures. Why are we finding young people adversely affected? What are the policies that seem to work against people being able to support their families, support themselves? And so what we're looking at, I think, in relation to churches, are them starting to think, okay, we're doing this. We may have to do this with other organisations. So partnerships are proliferating, which are fantastic. But also we need to challenge those structures and policies that seem to be disenfranchising people as well.
Sure. Perhaps if I could just bring Hugh in here. In your piece and video, you also talked about inequalities that the pandemic has exposed. Could you say perhaps a bit about the inequality on an international scale in some of the countries that you work in?
Sure, and thanks again for the invitation. I mean, yeah, my piece looks at the issue from an international perspective, and we've seen that the pandemic has hit developing countries extremely hard. Perhaps we've all seen the images of millions and millions of migrant workers in India, perhaps, who lost their jobs very quickly in big cities like Delhi and Bangalore, had to head back to their villages, so to speak, and were penniless in doing so. And we've seen scenes in South America, in Brazil, of communities left destitute because of the pandemic, and also in very vulnerable situations because of lack of healthcare and access to hospitals and so on. And we've seen situations in developed countries as well. We've seen the TV footage of huge queues for food banks in the United States and lack of social welfare provisions in that country as well, meaning communities are left quite destitute. And as I mentioned in my video and in the article, it's particular groups, women who are often vulnerable in these situations, often the carers who are who find it most difficult, also as frontline workers, as I said, but also Black people who have been affected most dramatically by the virus, in developed countries as well as in developing countries. Who are in the UK and the US, the data is absolutely clear that Black people are dying at a higher rate because they come from poorer communities, often have underlying medical conditions in general. So those are all examples from outside the UK where the pandemic has had a discriminatory and unequal impact on different communities.
Thank you. You've also written in your article and in your video as well about the need for collaboration between countries. Is that something you're seeing?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, we've seen in the European context, the barriers going up, the borders going up at the early phase of the pandemic, for good reason. I mean, stopping people traveling was a good idea and remains so in terms of controlling the spread of the virus, but it also fueled to some extent a nationalist narrative, I think. But now we need to see a very much of an international perspective on issues around protecting the environment, for instance, using the money which is being channeled into recovery programs in order to support the Paris Declaration, in order to encourage a promotion of renewables over fossil fuels, for instance. And also, as I mentioned, most immediately, the race to develop a vaccine. It should be a race together to do that. It should be cooperation that's underpinning that, rather than an effort said by some governments. We think of the White House, for instance, of buying up, drug companies and in order to corner the market, and that's the wrong approach. We need cooperation in terms of developing a vaccine quickly that would help many, many people, including the poorest people. So those are a couple of examples.
Sure. Eve, just turning to you, Hugh's already mentioned women bearing the brunt of in the pandemic. Something you address in your article about the different collared workers, workers of wearing different collars, white collar, blue collar, but also pink collar. You mentioned women. Could you say a bit about that, and perhaps also about how this inequality has been shown up in the pandemic, particularly in the workplace between different types of employment?
Well, Hugh will be able to say more about the international effect, but thinking about the UK, women have had to take a disproportionate amount of the burden around homeschooling and caring, and that has meant that for many of them, they've either had to take fewer hours from work or take pay cuts in order to be able to juggle that. And of course, that may have a knock-on effect about their future prospects. And of course, it is a generalism, although there is some statistical evidence to support it, because it's not always women who are the primary carer. But it does seem to be something that has shown, again, the kind of underlying inequality around what happens when the chips are down, around what happens with the genders. Of course, since I wrote the article, there have been different announcements about what will happen with schooling, which will have a huge effect on this. Sitting in Scotland, we had originally been told that when the schools went back in the autumn, they would only be going back a day a week, which again would have meant another quarter of women having to essentially be unable to work or be able to work in only a patchy way while they homeschooled or looked after their children. I think both in England and Scotland, and indeed in Wales and Ireland, there is an intention now for schools to go back full-time in the autumn. But of course, we don't know if there'll be a second spike. We don't know whether that will be possible. So I do worry about that, because when you look at the read across, that has meant that, for instance, economics, commentators in economics have been disproportionately men, because the female economists who would normally be available to be able to comment on coronavirus and the global situation have been busy looking after their children. And that's just one specific example where there have been academic papers produced on this problem, but I'm sure that is the case across the whole piece. And of course, if we're in a global pandemic, we need women's voices as well about how on earth we sort this out, both from an academic and economic and policy context. And if they're frankly busy trying to make sure the Wi-Fi is on so their kids can do their literacy tests, then that's just not going to be possible. So I think there has been a hit for women in this environment.
You also write in your piece about, and you express particular concern for the younger generation, or the uncollared, as you describe them. Could you say a bit about why you're particularly concerned about them, and perhaps what one of your remedies would be, particularly the National Citizen Civic Service?
So the government was already worried about youth unemployment because it was standing at 10% before we entered this pandemic. And as I say in the article and in that video, there's a disproportionately large number of the under 25s employed by the most vulnerable industries who've been particularly hit by lockdown. So the forecasts are already at about 20% for youth unemployment in the autumn. And that means a huge number of people who just have not even had a chance yet. And it's to be welcomed that the government are thinking about schemes to essentially offer subsidy for work placements and that kind of thing. But we've been there before with apprentice schemes, and what we've noticed is employers just don't take them up at the levels that we need them to really fix the problem. And if you think what's happening to organisations at the moment, they're being decimated. They have fewer staff, fewer resources. They don't have the time to train a whole load of rookies for a very small amount of money from the government. So there's a real problem that it's a lovely policy offer, but I don't think it really attacks the problem. So I think we need some very creative solutions about what do we do to get people started, because we are going to have a massive crisis on our hands if there's 20% of the under 25s don't get into work for another year, 18 months, while we gradually try and recover as a country.
Can I just bring in Harry here? I was I think you're over 25, but I just wondered, people among your peers, perhaps in their late 20s, early 30s, have you sensed that anxiety about lack of career opportunities and not being able to get on a ladder?
Yes, I think, again, even before the coronavirus had hit, it was quite common for, people I was at school with, at uni with, to be on temporary contracts or jumping between jobs and trying to make ends meet. And so I think in amongst the long-term employed being on furlough and there still being an uncertainty about redundancies, there's almost a sense of there being absolutely no chance of a job in the next 6 months or beyond. And so looking for things outside of their expertise, going back to the blue collar work or the hospitality business, and that in itself being affected further. So I think there's a growing sense of unease, and as with all of this, it not being for a defined time frame either. So it's not just 3 months of uncertainty, it's possibly 6, possibly a year. And I think that has ramifications as well.
Sure. I was struck in your article and video about, how you rightly see the creative arts as about much more than simply entertainment, but you think they could be a means by which we imagine a fairer world. Could you elaborate on that a bit more, what you mean by that?
Yes, I think one of the interesting things has been, when talking about the arts, what that means. So, there was a payout this week for the arts in general, but then today there's been a huge push from the comedy industry because that's not really seen as part of that. And there are people who, when they hear art, they think of the National Portrait Gallery or going to the opera. And whilst it absolutely is that, for some people, there's a much broader sense. And so I think for me, what excites me about art is the ability it has to shift your perspective. And, I came at it from the angle of performance poetry, which I'm aware is fairly niche, but I have been to comedy gigs that have informed me far more than any news broadcast could on current affairs or otherwise. And I think there is a broader sense of what an artist is or does that I think is akin to being a philosopher or at points theologian or, being a dreamer. And I think it is absolutely understandable that dreaming might not be seen as an essential thing to do when people are trying to stay alive. There was a survey done where artists came at the top of non-essential jobs, but very much the illustration they used was someone in a barrier with a moustache. So I think that's how people see artists. But I think there is so much uncertainty, and I think imagination is such a key part of what the future holds, and that is part and parcel of being an artist. So I think even before there was a pandemic on, people were dreaming up alternate futures, and the hope is that there's more of an audience to listen to those ideas. I know Eve mentioned universal basic income. That was seen as something hugely on the periphery until a few months ago. And so I think, as with that, hopefully there is a chance for radical change, and artists can be a part of that conversation.
Thanks for mentioning universal basic income. It's something Eve mentions in her post-pandemic piece, but also wrote a extended piece for us about a few months ago. Eve, it's an idea that some see as quite radical. We had a letter in the Church Times last week, 3rd of July, saying it would be too expensive and difficult to implement and wouldn't incentivize work. Would you mind responding to a few of those criticisms? I'm sure you're familiar with them.
I love the idea about what is expensive and what isn't, because it's expensive to have an NHS, it's expensive to have a nuclear deterrent, it's expensive to have a whole load of things that we choose to have, HS2, a whole load of other things that have been announced by the Chancellor this week. It's all about choice and about priorities. I think it'll be more expensive if we have violence on the streets in the autumn, because the simmering we're already seeing about the resentments being caused by this chronic inequality in the underclass that Sharon talked about, that's not going to end well. I think the kind of no deal Brexit looming, there's an awful lot of bad stuff coming in the autumn. and it's something that we can ill afford already. So I think it depends what you think is value, what do you think is money, what do you think is our job as citizens, really. A lot of people have said 5% increase on tax would cover it. A lot of people have said that actually if you just take out the personal allowance in tax terms, that would cover it, which very few people would actually notice. So it depends what level you set it at and what you were doing it for. But it feels to me that the two main objections to universal basic income are political irreversibility and moral hazard. One of those is mentioned in that letter. And moral hazard, I think that there is a sort of, and this is why I feel I've had a Damascene conversion about it, because my upbringing was very much about no such thing as a free lunch and mustn't be idle and mustn't incentivize skiving and all that kind of thing. But that's not Christian, actually. And what we've seen with the job retention scheme is there's been massive amounts of free money handed out. And have we seen people rioting in the streets and knocking grannies on the head because they happen to be alone at the moment? Have we seen bad behaviour? No, we've seen extraordinary good behaviour, people helping their neighbours, collecting their shopping, reaching out, protecting each other. So the moral hazard thing, I think we may have been a bit kidnapped by Freud on that front, and we've got some very recent evidence to show we can trust people more than we thought. The political irreversibility, we have a window now, because everyone knows coronavirus has been a massive hit and something none of us wanted or expected. These are extraordinary times, and we just don't know what universal basic income would actually do. It's all very theoretical. There have been a few pilots internationally, but there isn't really any good data. So this is the one time I think we've got a really good shot at it, because when I was asked to look at the future of work, the immediate future of work is really bad for an awful lot of people and will be so for at least a year. So one thing we can do is use that year to take the job retention scheme into an equivalent universal basic income year, call it a recovery payment or a whatever would make it politically okay, and actually address this problem of the underclass that Sharon talked about. Why do we have food banks increasing 89% when they were awful enough already? Why do we have period poverty? Why do we have destitution on levels we've just not seen before in this country? We need to just sort that out while we've got time. And it feels to me that this is a time where we might accept higher taxation. We might accept the sort of national database that would be necessary to be able to deploy this well, so that it would be easy to administer, which was another point in that letter. And it feels to me we have a real opportunity to do something extraordinary, very much in the tradition of William Temple.
Thank you. We've had some support for that on the comments feed on YouTube. People saying they particularly like the idea of it restoring dignity. I just wonder if I could bring you in, Sharon, whether this idea of universal basic income is something you think might address some of the inequalities that you've talked about, or if there are any other seemingly radical policy ideas that you would like to see really be taken seriously at this time, that, as Eve highlighted, there's an opportunity now, there's a window.
I think that's been astounding, is this altruism, this social altruism that's been so surprising to a lot of us. And it's kind of a shock, because on the one hand, we are ever so optimistic about the good that people bring to their communities, but it's gone way above any expectation. And that says, a lot about hope. And it says a lot about how much people are willing to sacrifice. And it's very, it's integral to our faith. And it's something that we can join together and become much more positive about, in terms of a society, a future society that embraces all. And, the rise in, particularly amongst the young people, about their abhorrence about systemic racism, and the people that have come out, it says something profound is happening. And I just wonder if our government, those that are in authority, are courageous enough to take those risks. And it's not just around monetary risk and finances, but there's something about the sort of moral imperative about who we are, rather than this individualistic approach that has sort of seeped into our very consciousness as a society. and for us to be brave enough to say, actually, it's not about the individual anymore. It's about much more communal orientation. And therefore, how can we enshrine that in our policies, in our welfare system, which has always been there, but has actually become less and less over the years. And I love what Harry was saying about the art as well. I sort of digress slightly, but actually it's because of the art, we are the people who we are. It's the creative imagination of the possibilities of what could be. And so seeing that as being an important, integral part to our community orientation, our community life is so important. And it just feels like those conversations are critical now, more critical now than ever before. So yes, I support what you're saying about universal basic income, but there are those caveats, and I think we shouldn't be afraid to talk about those ramifications, but even considering it is a really important aspect of this new way of thinking about how we can support everybody.
Thank you. Hugh, perhaps I could just bring you in to talk about some of that word risk that Sharon mentioned stood out to me. I mean, are there risks that nation states need to be taking? And is it at all realistic that they will act in a way that is more bearing in mind the collective over the individual, or the international community over the nation state?
That's a good question. I mean, just to pick up a few of the points that have been made, I really think you're right, Eve, this is a good moment to take opportunities to capture the moment, as you put it. And I think, doing a one-year test of the universal basic income would be a good idea at this time. I'd like to give you a couple of examples of in a sense, the opportunities of this moment that happened in Germany, where I live, which are quite positive sparks. I think Harry used the word earlier in his video. One is, again, about very bad working conditions. We talked about the inequalities, in the meat industry in Germany, in abattoirs. Sounds a bit obscure, but let me get to the point. Terrible working conditions. Migrant workers from Eastern Europe have been working for slave wages in slave conditions, basically, for many years in the meat industry, in abattoirs. This pandemic has in a way shone light on that in a very dramatic way, because they've been a center of the virus, and thousands of people have caught the virus in these abattoirs in Germany. And now a law is going to be passed to basically sort that out and to stop the type of employment arrangements that have happened in these abattoirs in the future. And that's a really positive development, and that's an outcome of the crisis caused by the pandemic. Another quick example is the German government was under huge pressure from the car industry to basically give the car industry huge subsidies as part of the economic recovery program the government passed a couple of weeks ago. They resisted that pressure, in fact. They resisted the pressure from the car industry, and they didn't do it because they realized this would be a step away from promoting renewables as the way forward for the economy. And that's really good as well. So governments should be grasping these moments which are happening. And that's happening to some extent elsewhere in the world as well. But those are just two examples from Germany of best practice going forward, of building back better.
Talking about government intervention, funding coming from government. Harry, you mentioned in your video the I think it's £1.57 billion that was announced for the arts this week. Could you say a bit more about how helpful you think that will be sort of on the ground among artists like yourself and those you know?
Yes, I think one of the difficulties is artist is such a broad term. So my experience as a performance poet / one half of a comedy rap jazz duo is fairly unique in that. But I think what has struck me is the stats that came out from the comedy industry, I think, reflect some of that. And it was saying that a third of comedy venues believe they'll be forced to close within the next 6 months, with almost 80% facing closure within the next year. So I think that's almost the death of an entire part of our society. And yes, 1.5 billion is a lot of money,
but it's also covering a huge range of things. And so I think there are parts of that that are brilliant, that are going to help huge institutions stay afloat. And the hope is that that will then provide employment for lots of others. But there are also hugely influential local communities that are centered around small theatres or comedy clubs or elsewhere. And there is no way of knowing how much of that is going to come down and impact them. So I think it's obviously some money is better than no money, but it's very hard at this stage to know who is going to directly benefit from that, or even indirectly.
Eve, to bring you, I think you had a few thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, we've heard quite a bit about silenced voices, whether it's the underclass or the BAME community or a whole range of people who are not being heard. I talked about the women who are too busy looking after their children to get involved in economic policy at the moment. And I think I just really like to support what Harry said, that the whole point about the cultural sector is that they're doing a couple of really crucial things for us, and always, but particularly in these times, which is they're being both prophets and jesters. They're doing an awful lot of calling out. They're speaking truth to power. They're doing the dreaming that Harry talked about to show us what we could avoid becoming as well as what we should become. And we as a nation would be so impoverished if we let that go. And that's why things like a kind of year of a recovery wage or whatever we want to call it would be so crucial to protect a huge number of, you might call them cultural workers, who are actually our conscience, they're our joy, they're our entertainment, they're our story, and actually we really need to protect that.
Sure. Just one thing I thought of when talking about sort of speaking out prophetically was the recent announcement of the merger of the Department for International Development and the Foreign Office, which I've never seen aid agencies come out so united and strongly opposed to a government announcement, I think. Perhaps Hugh, you just say a bit about that and what your perspective is on that news.
Yeah, we're concerned about that it may distract away from the government's focus on the 0.7%, aid priority, aid commitment. We're also worried because, as the world tries to recover, there's also a real need for clarity on the way where money is spent. And DFID has not a bad record actually of tracking the effectiveness of development aid and whether it's reaching the poorest, whether civil society groups are involved in monitoring where it's going and so on. We worry that will go away as well. And that it could set a trend as well, that away from a positive focus on development support, which is driven by messages around reducing inequality, tackling discrimination, and so on. So we find it a worrying development.
Sure. Just a question that's come up on our YouTube comments from Adrian Gallagher. Perhaps I put this to Sharon as a priest. Is there a recommendation for how to do a social audit of a parish or community? Others feel free to. I wonder if that's something that you've done.
Yeah, there are lots of different ways of doing that. There are various tools. I mean, at one end, there's something like mission action planning or faith-based facilitation. There are various structures, but there is something about listening, about going out of our way to do the sort of deep listening and being open and not assuming that our perspective, that we somehow have the perspective on things. So there's engaging and being honest and going to the places that we don't normally go to. Churches are very good at being insular. And I think there's been this dawning realization that we have to look outside, that we have to look at our community, it's the whole parish, and that within that parish, there are various stakeholders. So how do we go out of our way to engage with them? So I think that is actually, it's a very good question. It's crucial. And if we are supposed to do what we're called to do in terms of being a service and also witness, we have to make an effort in order and be very intentional in order to do that. So it's something that we, certainly within my diocese, try to encourage, this outward orientation, because it's important to who we are
and to what we hope to do in serving others.
Sure, thank you. We haven't got much more time. We have had a question from Alan Hillier saying he appreciates these sound analyses, searching a bit more for action points. Could each of the speakers say what they change, A, at the national church level and B, at the local parish church level? Would that be okay just to quickly go around and just get and if you want to broaden that out perhaps to the sort of local community level, that's fine. So can we start with Eve?
Yeah, I think one of the things I said in my article was I think at local church level, a bit like doing social audits, we need to be a bit clearer about the skills we've got that we could share, so that if we are entering a period of joblessness, we would be able to help each other tool up in order to emerge stronger. Mentoring, support. There are lots of people in our congregations who've been here before where we've had prolonged periods of unemployment in this country, and they know what that's like. So as well as listening around the unheard voices, listening for the skills and the generosity that we could access, given what Sharon said about altruism, I think would be really important. At a national level, I think we should be lobbying for our William Temple moment, to restore dignity to the underclass through a year of universal basic income. So I would really encourage you all to get on the Compass website, tick the boxes, write to your MP, get parliamentary questions asked, and let's try and do this.
Thanks. Harry, can I ask you next? Big picture and sort of more local.
Yeah, I think the crossover, whether it's arts or church in a more broad sense, is this fear that in a time of crises, we're going backwards, whether that is in the gender roles in the household or the voices being heard. And I think a huge worry is with the arts, when it's squished, are people going to go for their idea of a safe bet, which is the more classical, less experimental, and as a result, less diverse work. So I think in churches, in local communities, it's about, as Sharon said, going out of your way to hear those voices that are maybe not always a part of that conversation and inviting them to take part in it.
Thank you. Hugh, perhaps I could ask you to contribute to that.
Okay, a couple of issues we haven't spoken about so much. In your local community, support your local women's shelter. Domestic violence has been a serious problem. A rise in domestic violence, everybody cramped up at home in this pandemic, and support places where are supporting women with money, with your support, with other sorts of donations. That's at the local level. At the national level, think about the impact of technology. Many governments have used technology, sometimes in good ways, developing good tracker apps, which are, meant to help people and identify who has the virus, but in many cases they're not good. They've also used surveillance in bad ways, in Russia, for instance, and other countries. So ask your government what technology is being used, question it, make it more democratic, make sure it's being directed in the right way, and not a funnel for resources which could be used more effectively in other ways to help the poor, the disadvantaged, the ones who don't have access to smartphones. Those are some ideas.
Thank you. And finally, Sharon, the national church and parish level.
I think my good colleagues have mentioned most of the great things that could be done, but I think there's also an issue about looking at issues of power and influence as well at a national level. How can we use our influence in various quarters in an effective way? And also thinking about our own structural power and our maybe ability to exclude and collude. So we have to do some introspection as well. There's also an issue around how we support the local churches to work together, and maybe even across diocese, not just an internal thing. And it's what we've talked about, the stewardship of skills, and because I think the whole church would benefit for that. And just one more thing is, these things are starting to emerge already. They're embryonic. So going forward, how can we ensure that they're sustained? And I think that's a crucial element going forward.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we're coming up to our time limit. I'd love to stay and discuss this more. Thank you all very much for your time today. And just say if people haven't read the excellent articles you wrote there, available at churchtimes.co.uk/post-pandemic. They're all in that place. And this will also be available to watch or rewatch afterwards on our YouTube channel. Just remains me to say that we're now going to hear, for those who'd like to stay around, a really interesting discussion between our editor Paul Handley and two academics that the newspaper has been working with, Leslie Francis and Andrew Village, about the coronavirus church and you survey, a major survey of how different parts of the church have responded to this pandemic. So do stay around. We'll also be posting that as a podcast tomorrow morning. But thank you all very much for your time, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Paul Handley, editor of the Church Times, and I'm here with Andrew Village and Leslie Francis, the two people behind the coronavirus, the church and you survey that we've been running in the Church Times for the last few weeks. And we've just published the first set of results, quite extensive results, but there are plenty more to come out as the survey results are being analysed by these two. Leslie, tell me what was the purpose behind the survey?
Good morning, Paul. As you will recall, this is the third time we've had the opportunity to work with the Church Times in a Church Times survey. And I really want to thank you and all your readers for the way in which those surveys have run. Andrew and I work as empirical theologians. And as empirical theologians, we take our mandate from Jesus' teaching to go and to observe the sower. When the lockdown happened, we saw the sower working in a very different kind of way. And we thought there'd be a lot to learn by going to observe. As empirical theologians, we're people who take theology seriously, Bible, doctrine, but we're also people who take seriously the methods of the social sciences. The kind of surveys we work on are designed to be able to do two things. The first is to give some headline statistics, and we can deliver those quite quickly. But when we design surveys, we design them with some fairly sophisticated theory in mind that we need to dig down to develop more slowly. As time goes on, we have got the data to learn quite a lot. Imagine us as scientists looking for that vaccine, the vaccine that could help things to be different in the future. We're not there yet, but the work is progressing. What I'd like to do is to pass across to my colleague Andy, who's there with the headline information, because that's what we're most interested in today.
Thank you, Leslie, and good morning, Paul. Yes, the survey's been running for quite a few weeks now, and we've got nearly 7,000 replies on the main survey. We also have versions for the Catholic Church and in Ireland and in the UK. And so we're really excited by the response rate that we're getting.
I'd like to jump really to because I know scientists can talk about process endlessly, but I would like to get to some results here.
Yes. Okay.
Can you give us some headlines?
Okay. Well, let's have a look at start with well-being. Who was the most stressed? Interestingly, across the different measures we had, consistently you can see that young people under 50, were more stressed than old people. Now it's interesting because everyone talks about the virus affecting old people, but in terms of how the process of being locked down affects people, younger people consistently come out as feeling less close to God, feeling more stressed, feeling more frustrated. And if you think about it, they're the people trying to manage, perhaps still working, perhaps family budgets and so on. They're trying to do all those other things. Interestingly, we asked people if they were self-isolated during the lockdown, and self-isolated people sometimes did better than others. So in a sense, that being cut off from all the pressures, that emerges in the data. Anglo-Catholics consistently seem to report less good scores on well-being. they seem to struggle more with this whole process than evangelicals, for example. And then if you look at, I mean, I think that's to do with a whole load of different things that we need to unpick, but it's an interesting result that's fairly consistent. Clergy are interesting because clergy came out higher on the stress, particularly those of working age. They were stressed. And there's a little bit of, we don't have enough of the hierarchy of the church, but the hierarchy, you know, bishops, archdeacons, they reported the highest levels of stress. But if you look at lay people, they were less stressed, but they were less happy. So clergy reported better spiritual well-being, but more stress. So it's really interesting to see how, you know, you're beginning to unpick the differential effects of this lockdown on groups.
It's all, I mean, I know that you struggle over the wording of the questions, but I mean, the whole issue of stress, for example, is a particularly difficult one because of course stress and pressure are both elements of fulfillment as well. So if you're busy, you can say you're stressed, but you're also potentially more fulfilled than somebody who's calmer. So
yes. I mean, one of the things we tried to do was to build in what we call balanced affect in there. And Leslie might be able to address this thing about balanced affect, perhaps explain that a bit more.
Yes, I will. One of the theories we bring in from psychology is this notion of balanced affect. We understand how people feel about things, not with one system, but two systems. People feeling negatively about things is one system. People feeling positively about things is the other system. You can't predict the one from the other. Where bad things begin to happen in people's lives is when the negative affect, the bad things, do not have the good things, positive affect, to counterbalance them. What we understand about Christian living, both for clergy and for lay people, is that there are lots of things that support positive affect. What we're not so sure of is the extent to which that positive affect building structure works in online church as it works so well in offline church.
Okay. Good. Well, that moves on really into how the church has functioned during this period, the receiving and giving of ministry. Tell me some what you found out about that.
Okay, yes. So we sent people down different routes depending on whether they had given or received ministry. So the people giving were not just clergy, they included lay ministers as well. So I was struck by the sheer range of services that people had accessed, all sorts of different ways, and lots of people had accessed several different types of service, but overwhelmingly people, about 80% or more, had accessed services from their own church. So I think the churches generally rose to the occasion. They generally got some stuff out there. We looked at the Easter services not long after the lockdown, and nearly all churches by then were at least able to give services on Good Friday and Easter Day. So on the whole, you know, we done good. We rose to the occasion. So generally people were very positive about the online worship, but there were some variations between groups again. So one of the questions we asked was, how was the online worship compared with your normal worship? And I was looking at some of that data. It was quite interesting. So generally speaking, men tended to feel that services were less good compared with usual. When you look at women, they were more positive. Interestingly, in rural areas, people tended to say that the online services were better than they normally got, which is might be saying something about rural worship, but that's a trend it's not a very strong trend, but it is there. But interestingly, the younger people under 50, were less positive about online worship, and you do see this emerging across several areas. You might think that younger people, they're into online stuff, and that's what they want. They'll take to it like a duck to water. I think there's something going on where actually some of our younger worshippers, people in their 20s and 30s, don't actually want to worship online. I think that, you know, part of the reason why they belong to the church, why they're the sort of people who fill out church time surveys, is they actually want to go to churches. They want to go to buildings. Yeah.
Or alternatively, it could be that they have a higher standard.
They may have a higher standard, yes.
So they're more used to doing stuff well online. And if they're stuck with an amateurish production, then they're not going to stick with it, are they?
Yes, yeah.
So may I come in on that one? Because one of the theories, again, we wanted to try to test out was the distinction between participation and observation. Online worship is a good opportunity to observe, but not perhaps to feel to participate. And I think what we learned from the responses was there was a much lower level of real participation than we'd have liked to have seen. Again, a question for the future: what happens when people are not participating in worship? Does it have the same consequences for life transformation?
Sure. I mean, and this is a debate that's gone on for decades with public broadcast worship, of course. So, the public broadcasters have largely withdrawn from these sorts of services because they're aware that they don't function as expected, but then possibly they're not putting the effort into them that needs to be made. I noticed about there's been a lot of debate in the paper, obviously, about communion. What have you found out about participation and communion?
Yes, I mean, obviously, for various reasons, active participation by people at home was very low, and I think that was a kind of instruction in some ways. But you might think that, say, for example, the Anglo-Catholic wing with a very high sense of the Eucharist, would want that ministry most, but also might be most anxious about dispersing it too easily. And that's more or less what you find. So Anglo-Catholics were more happy with, for example, priests celebrating on their own at home without broadcasting, but evangelicals were more comfortable about lay people at home receiving with their own bread and wine, much more. So there's quite stark differences across the traditions. And I think what the lockdown did is expose some very different theological approaches to the Eucharist that have long been there. But what lockdown and isolation does is to ask the question, well, what do we do? And theologically, what are we doing with this? So that's a really interesting thing to look at more detail. So,
okay. There's tons we could talk about. One just it's an observation really is that most surveys I work with, the results of are normally snap. They're taken over a weekend or a couple of days or something. But this is run for several weeks through a very shifting situation. Will you be able to, or are you able to determine different answers at different points of the pandemic?
Yes, we can. And one of the reasons why we need large samples is because of that, because we have to control for all sorts of things. I mean, one of the things that happened was we invited Methodists and Baptists and various other people to take part, and they did come on board a little bit, and so they form a higher proportion of the later responses. So we have to be careful we're not getting shifts. But yes, you can if you control for some of those things. I haven't done a lot of analysis yet, but it did seem to me that some of the questions we asked about how the government were handling the lockdown did seem to slightly deteriorate as things went on. And I think there is a growing sense in the country that maybe things weren't handled as well as we thought they were at the beginning, and that might emerge.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, Leslie, you talked about you had the analogy of a vaccine. Therefore, if we're looking into the future, can you give some pointers to how the church might use this information? What should it do better, given the huge range of experiences they've got to deal with?
Yeah, I suppose there are 4 things that I'd like the church to think about. And the first is rooted in what I wanted to call a theology of individual differences. For a long time, I think the data has been showing that the Anglican Church is ministering to a really highly specific group of people within society. God loves a bigger group of people than that. What can we learn about extending the range? Inclusivity, online, offline, blended approach may enhance inclusivity, theology of individual differences. The second thing that I think we need to look at is what church is doing to build up both the life of Christ within its individual participants and how it is that the ministry of Christ is shared with the wider community. Sociologists talk about bonding capital and bridging capital. One of my anxieties when I set up this survey was that I was fearing that reduction of bonding capital by people not meeting together would begin to weaken the bridging capital, the capacity of church to serve community. We need to be aware of that, because one of the major implications of that is the shifting of the presence of church in society, the shifting from being church with a local presence into being a sect with a gathered presence, online gathered or offline gathered. An enormous ecclesiological issue in that as well. And the fourth thing we've already hinted at is to do with what church and the Christian faith is doing to enhance the well-being, both of individuals and of society. Again, the bringing of people together in place may have psychological impact to enhance the benefit of positive affect that counterbalances those things that we can't take away. The new normal that we're going to get is a normal in which I think we all anticipate we're going to have to live with the uncertainty of that virus being around. The building up of positive psychological capital could be very important to counterbalance that. And there's a great deal within the gospel that enables that to be done. But it will be done differently in online and offline presences. Tiresome thing, scientists, they need to get into their data to understand what's going on with that data before they can really predict. I really hope we don't get another lockdown. But if we do, then I think the time is to look again with a similar kind of survey and to see how things are going to be in that situation compared with how they are in this. Time trends are important. Let's pray we don't get that lockdown. But if we do, let's also pray that we may have those resources to observe the seller, as well as to see the way in which the seller is behaving.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you both. That's, I hope we will be able to cover some more of the things that, as you pull things out of this. It's fascinating and important that it's an opportunity, it seems to me, for the church to move on an empirical basis rather than an inspirational one, which can sometimes not be as well focused.
That's precisely what we stand for.
Yes, absolutely. Excellent. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.